Hello, everybody. My name is Mirko Novakovic. I am co-founder and CEO of Zero, and welcome to Code Red. Code, because we are talking about code, and Red stands for requests, errors, and duration, the core metrics of observability. On this podcast, you will hear from leaders around our industry about what they are building, what's next in observability, and what you can do today to avoid your next outage.
Hello everyone, today my guest is Jacek Migdal. Jacek is the CEO and founder of Quesma, a database gateway tool that helps developers, teams route, translate, and optimize their queries. Before that, he spent a decade at Sumo Logic, where he led software engineering when the company went public in 2020. Jacek, I'm excited to welcome here at Code Red. And I always start the conversation with my initial question, which is, what was your biggest Code Red moment?
Well, probably, my biggest Code Red were like outages, that kind of like a big production issues. And there was like one which I was guilty because not only I wrote the code that was buggy, but also I have to deal with aftermath. And it was once upon a time when S3, like a blob service from AWS, was eventually consistent. We kind of like decide, okay, this is like a mechanism how we do our encryption keys. And we use we'll just use it to store our encryption keys. And the plan was perfect until the moment we realized, okay, this is like eventually consistent. So if you create those encryption keys, you want to make sure that you have like one encryption key, right? And, of course, that was a little bit complication, but, Zookeeper, we take like a log, we elect leaders, generate them once per day, and this looks like a perfect plan. And I wrote the original code, it passed audit, it worked for years, until one day in the middle of night, something broke down and there was like a lot of errors or like security issues in our service, like a flood of alerts. And people get spooked because, somebody may have been hacking us. But, luckily it was not looking like a hacking attack. But it was like data corruption. So, a little bit less spooked, but still quite spooked. And the story was that we are not able to decrypt data while it was going on. And it looked like, that concurrency and consistency is like really hard. So we double created those keys because, there was like by holding Zookeeper look, some computer lose machine. So there was like some rare edge case when this could happen. And we have those two issues. And it ended up being very hectic outage with several hotkey deploys and later like writing custom data procedure to re-encrypt data with write fix. So kind of like very hectic coding. It took until like a few days, but luckily we not lose like a byte of customer data.
Yeah, that's always good. Hey, and we met last week at KubeCon in London at the Dig Ventures breakfast. Tell me a little bit about how was KubeCon for you? What stood out for you? I also know that you did a talk. Tell me a little bit about your experience.
So KubeCon is one of our primary audience. I believe a lot of, even though we do with databases, a lot of like decisions are still made by DevOps and they feel the pain. So we are a little bit earlier than Zero. We got like awesome booth, but we're still enjoying a lot of those conversations with like early adopters, early users, or prospective early users, as well as like it's good audience to have like a talk and educate them about some topics like which we are passionate like observability query languages.
And talking about, you have been at Sumo Logic, so one of the public big players. Not public anymore, right? Got acquired by a PE. But by the way, I was yesterday I had a conversation with Ramin, the former CEO. He's now at DFJ, right? Venture capital fund. And we were chatting, and so you have been there for 10 years.
Yeah.
Is that kind of where the initial idea of Quesma came from? Did you run into that problem, or how do you come up with it? Because I saw you spent 10 years, then you did a break, and then you founded Quesma. So it must stood out to you that this is a problem you want to attack.
Yeah, I wrote like a blog post how I was looking, but I came down to roots. It turned out that I was seeing a lot of like data stacks from when I was like teenager. My dad was introducing Oracle everywhere, and I saw how it was awesome first, and now how it's bad. At Facebook, I changed data format. And some of my successful projects at Sumo Logic were data migration projects, which could bring enormous efficiency gains or like a data insight gains, but they are very tricky to do. And I was so surprised that there's zero product offering around that. It's like almost all service business, how to data migrations or like how to make changes in data. And most of those projects got terrible and engineers hate them. So I figure out I like it sometimes. I have like a love-hate relation with that. But I figure out this is like very important to solve.
Let's start by, before we deep dive a little bit into observability and querying observability, explain a little bit what Quesma does, right? And what problem it solves and how it works for me as a developer.
Yeah, so for you as a developer, usually the problem is like with making any changes to your database, they like very coupled. You need to make, and especially on analytical side, like in transactional, you may be lucky because one application, one database, but in analytical, usually you have like a lot of integration points, how you put their data, how you query that, many clients, and anytime you try to make any change, something might break. So the vision of Quesma is like to put like a layer between many of your application and your data warehouse or analytical database, and which will allow you to make changes or add extra functionality or make that easier by decoupling them to smaller problems.
Okay, but it's not ETL, right?
It's not ETL. It's more like rewriting SQLs on fly.
Okay. So if you query the database with the old query, you could, in that layer, update the query to some sort of new data.
You could update the query, you could make changes. Sometimes you could, like when you change technology, you could like keep the same queries and update them on flight, debug it or verify what would happen if something would change, and if you rewrite it, would it work? Would it not? Would it return the same data?
Oh, interesting.
So it's kind of like a blue-green deployments for data warehouses.
And you could also translate between different query technologies, or?
Yes, that's very common. Like, people are asking, that's like also like part of the vision, that the core of SQL is like same, but there is a lot of like little things here and there that make it either you need to make some changes, or sometimes there's like a tiny semantic difference. And for some people, that's fine. And for some people, there's like one thing that will break your form migration.
Okay. So what we did, for example, just as an example, we use PromQL as the query language, and we will discuss about that. But we use ClickHouse as our database storage. And so what my developers essentially did, they took the PromQL query language layer, forked it, and then translated all the access to the database from the PromQL layer to the PromQL storage to ClickHouse, right? So that we basically used exactly the same PromQL layer, but now the data store is ClickHouse. Is that something where we could essentially put Quesma in between and then do exactly that?
Yeah, that's like actually like, that's one of the good things, because this is like interoperability use case, and a lot of people sometimes ask it. Oh, I would really love to use PromQL with, let's say, Snowflake or Databricks. Can you do this, right? And the story is, yes, you can do this. Of course, there's like sometimes like threshold, but for a lot of use cases, just work fine, right? So one of the use cases is like this interoperability. Of course, we have not implemented this PromQL particularly yet, but we implemented very similarly like Elasticsearch on top of ClickHouse, right? So people want to use Elasticsearch APIs, but either they don't want to migrate, or they use some tools that just work with Elasticsearch APIs, and that layer could transparently translate that.
This whole podcast came from a discussion we had on LinkedIn, right? About standardization of query languages, especially for observability data. And there is actually today no standardization, right? There's a lack of standardization. Open telemetry, there is an idea to standardize it. I also know, and today I read everything around what happened at KubeCon. There were a few discussions, right, from people from eBay and others, how to use, for example, SQL as a standardized language for hotel data. But I think it's very early, and it will be, in my point of view, very hard to have all the vendors agree on a query language. But tell me a little bit about your opinion. Does it make sense to standardize on a query language? And how do you see that?
Yeah, like, to be fair, that's like a very hard problem. And there's like some committee for over 2 years, and there's no specification yet. And any time you try to make some move, There's a lot of architects with a lot of opinions. So it's not an easy problem. I would say I would argue PromQL is a little bit of standardization on metric scoring. Still, there's other format, but in the log event line is completely Wild West. It's a dozen of languages for no good reason. My thinking is yes, there should be. It should be more standard, but it's not a standard that we should specify everything, because that would be terrible for innovation. Then you cannot add new functionality. I believe this is a futile attempt. I believe in more standards like SQL, that there is some core that, this core would work the same. And this kind of table stake for any observability vendor is not hard to implement. But of course, not limiting people to innovate on top of that core or the other parts, right? So it's more SQL, and people will still diverge a little bit. But at least you could also write applications on top of many observability vendors.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, when we looked at query language, when we started this year, we looked at 4 different options. We looked at building our own query language, right? Which a lot of vendors do. And we said, okay, let's not do that, right? Let's look at existing standards. And so we looked at SQL. We looked at Custo type of language, right? The piped languages that Splunk uses, or also Elastic, I think, today. And then number 3, we looked at PromQL. Yeah, we decided for PromQL, and we can discuss why. But I think there are pros and cons for all of these approaches, right? And some vendors do multiple of them, right?
Well, I'm kind of thinking that SQL will need to evolve. Yes, I'm definitely a big SQL fan for my life, I would say. The fact is just that the SQL tends to lack. There was a JSON happen, and people say, oh, maybe SQL will be irrelevant because JSONs and data. But what happened is usually SQL lack a little bit, but then people find ideas how to incorporate it back to SQL. So I don't believe vanilla SQL will do it, but I believe there is a good ideas, especially by Google BigQuery team, about their pipe syntax. How can we evolve SQL to be as good as Custo and other parts to serve this use case really well?
Yeah, you told me about the pipe specification in SQL at the conference. Can you elaborate a little bit on it? What does it do? Is it a little bit like mixing Custo with SQL?
Yeah.
Or?
So the idea, if you look all of these log pipeline language, they all look like Custo. If they're Splunk, Sumo Logic, they are incompatible. So the idea was okay, we would like to have a language, and even some ORM wrappers to SQL, if you don't know, from .NET Link, got this idea, oh, you should do it in more a pipe manner. And the reason is because it's more natural order how you query data. Oh, I pick this data set, and I want this thing, then I want this filtering, and you could add one operation after the other, which is especially more intuitive for iterative debugging, which is typical, do that. And the story that was okay, so this is the flow of SQL. But on the other hand, SQL is English, right? Everybody uses it. There's a tons of people who just know Excel and SQL. And asking everybody to learn new language is asking everybody to learn Esperanto. In theory, it makes sense. In practice, people aren't going to do that. They are not going to rebuild their ecosystem. So how can we adapt SQL and be fully backward compatible to this new era? So they invented this kind of a sugar syntax that, equivalent to SQL, which is adding this pipe and make it look like Custo.
Yeah, it makes sense. By the way, we also came to the conclusion that Custo is the most intuitive way of doing it, right? Piping, because as you said, right, you have one amount of data, and then you filter it, and then you filter it even more, and you filter it, and you basically, that's essentially how our brain works, right? So I can see it. Really interesting. I have to deep dive a little bit more into it, how SQL with pipes work, but I can see that working. We by the way, we decided for PromQL because we wanted to be very open and also reuse a lot of the things that exist in the community. And for example, there's Prometheus alerts, and there are projects like Awesome Prometheus alerts where you have hundreds of predefined alerts, and they are all based on PromQL.
Yeah.
And so we thought, okay, what is currently the one that's closest being a standard in terms of adoption, right? And that's why we we have chosen PromQL, though we know that from a language perspective, it's not close being as intuitive as, for example, a Custo, right?
Yeah, I believe with PromQL you make like a right choice because you are like a busy founder, like you get like a cheap product to market, like and the PromQL seems like an obvious choice, like the most standard one. I believe to some degree it's like a regular expressions, like people they're easy to write, they have their flaws, but they're like still so ubiquitous that even people like they always put somewhere in their YAML, or here's like my PromQL based alert. On the other hand, the biggest problem with PromQL is like they don't seem to scale that well. Like the attempts to write like log-based languages like LogQL, this language is not really popular, even though Grafana tried for a while. It's very hard for people to write something more than one-liner in PromQL, and a lot of it's more like a language optimized for writing than reading. And a lot of people have like a trouble of reading PromQL unless they were very trained to read it. So a lot of people need like a GUI to read like a PromQL what this thing is doing, right? While with some other like this pipe languages, that's much easier. And it's also like much easier to visualize step by step what's happening, right? If you have line by line, you could show, okay, the problem is line 5. Here what happens, this filter all of your data, right? Do you really want it, right? Like with PromQL is like too concise to sometimes see what's going on.
But how do you see, what would you say also from experience Sumo? So my point of view is I don't know, I don't want to say a percentage, but in more than 90% of the cases, people shouldn't use any query language, right? So the UI should be so good that behind the scenes, you basically generate the query language by providing a user experience with is essentially like a query builder or something very easy. And the query language itself should be more like, if the UX or if your query is really complicated, you will probably not be able to create a UX that can create everything for you. Then you switch into an expert mode and do queries. So do you think, from your experience, the query language should be something for 80% of the use case because the query language should be so easy that it's natural to do it? Or also, do you also think it's more an expert tool that you use?
Here I got like convoluted answers. I believe most people should not write the query language because it's kind of like, as you say, like many use cases, you could just generate it for them. But on the other hand, most people should be able to read this query language and explain what's going on, right? And I've seen this in many cases that, yes, there are some advanced users in security that will always write it, or if you want to build some UI tool or something, this language is like a very useful representation to what's going on. It's very useful to representation what this GUI is doing. And a lot of people get confused by the GUI of the vendors, especially some edge cases. They get confused sometimes. Okay, your AI agent got this hypothesis. It should always give you explanation why it came to that conclusion in like a written informal language. So I believe this language needs to be optimized for people to read, not to write.
I agree. By the way, we implemented a feature because I have the same issue, right? I'm not an expert PromQL user. I'm not using it every day. I did the course, I experimented with it, I understand it. But anytime I see a more complex PromQL query, I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh my God, right? I have to kind of relearn it. But then what we did is and that's coming to a topic that's probably interesting in the space, we actually did an AI-based translation tool where you can click an explain button. Mm-hmm. And then we use an AI to actually explain you the PromQL query, so to tell you, oh, this actually queries a number of services for this attribute, etc. So how do you see AI playing in the field of queries? Because it seems to, if you look at all the coding editors and stuff, it seems to be a perfect field if it's well documented for AI.
Yeah, and to be fair, that's like even in this paper pipe, usually the AI needs like a good context. Asking AI to write like a long query is like a hard exercise. There's a lot of paper that AI is like really good also, like if it writes the queries way as humans. So you write a little bit query, add a little filter, and this AI, sometimes like even much simpler AI can do this work. There was like a paper by Snowflake, there is a paper by Google that, don't ask AI to write page of SQL, ask it to write like a page, give it feedback, and do this like iterative loops. And the story that what I like pipe, you can pretty much give AI also like intermediate results sampled from each stage of the result. So it could also like reason about each stage of result and figure out, oh, this operation you are doing is actually doesn't make sense because you have like somewhere and this column is almost always null, right? And then you could like highlight to user, okay, the bug was in this line, or automatically AI could show you, oh, now I'm trying to rewrite in this line. So I believe it's happening. And I believe that's also like one of the motivation that in different languages would be good to collaborate with AI versus the language just for humans.
But would you see AI generating the query? Essentially would. Or would you say, I would query in natural language, right? I don't ask the AI to generate me a query, but I would ask the query directly in natural language. How would you see that?
I think always AI will translate into some formal language. So you would ask, okay, why my servers are crashing? And then AI say, oh, I look for this, and this thing. That's how I translated your request. I ran this query. Here's like what I found, right? And there will be always like some formal language explaining that even AI will use to ask about data. Because natural language, I don't believe it will be ever precise. And especially in outage debugging, it's a lot of edge cases. Sometimes like, okay, something bad happened and it was because of time zone shift, right? Things like that. So the little thing that you make in query makes sometimes like a huge difference.
Yeah, precision I can definitely see. I'm always asking myself if that precision is needed. If you ask a question and can the AI figure out the right precision that's needed, right? So not saying, hey, give me the logs of that service yesterday, 6 p.m., 12 minutes until then, or just saying, hey, give me the logs that were problematic yesterday evening for the outage, right? And then you don't need the exact precision because the AI will understand what you're looking for.
Yeah, but the AI behind the scene, the biggest advantage it has, it can run dozen of queries, not like one as a human. It could run dozen of queries and then look at all of them and look, okay, these results were not interesting. So we don't even need to bother you, Mirko, with them. But here's one query I ran that shows some interesting trend. I dig down, make a follow-up one. And here with this query, I'm suspecting this one Kubernetes pod is misbehaving, right? And then I believe in the high-stakes scenario, that's happening also like in the really outages, with really humans, you sometimes ask, why do you want to do this risky operation? And somebody gives you like, the reasoning, how they came to that conclusion. And the other engineers say, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Let's delete that pod. Or they came to conclusion, no, that's actually not the problem, right? That will make it worse.
So it's more, you're basically talking about agentic AI, right? Giving an agent that does the queries for you, evaluates, then gets more data, like a human essentially, right?
Yeah, I'm not so big believer in like a text to SQL. That's like not like that big problem as people thought. Because again, like you mentioned as before, there's a lot of creators, so you don't even need like a text to SQL. You could just click through group by this in any BI tool or in any observability tool. But I believe the biggest value in AI, they could ask like several queries, like look through default dashboards, make some additional filtering on problematic values, and then came with like 3 steps that will show the path to figuring what has happened.
Yeah, which is essentially more than querying then, right?
Yeah.
It's really giving it a task like search for the root cause of a problem. And then it does the queries and figures out itself how to do it.
Of course, I always believe humans will need sometimes to supervise those systems. So you'd like to have some visibility why it's happening during outage or why it has, after it has happened, what actually have you tried, right? And are your conclusions right? And sometimes these tools will be right, but expecting them to be 100%, no, like humans are even not 100%. So there will be like a lot of mistakes or wrong insight along the way.
Getting back to Quesma, right, and how you see AI and how you see your current use case, I saw that you have also different Quesma for different stacks. For example, you have Quesma for Elastic stack, right? So tell me a little bit, what's your current use case? What are you doing with it, with Kibana and all, ClickHouse and Elastic?
So yeah, I would say like I believe Dash Zero is attacking, I would say, rather people if you want really sophisticated experience, but it charge a little bit premium, like a Datadog. But I'm seeing also like the other spectrum of the market, like telcos, gaming companies, like a big brokers of some kind, which they have like a huge amount of logs. They could not really afford many solutions because it's too painful, but still logging for them is mission critical. And currently, a lot of them sit on using Elasticsearch, sometimes even self-hosted Elasticsearch. And it's just not the right technological solution because Elasticsearch was designed for Google style searches where you have like a top 10 searches, while what you need is like really fast analytical searches. And even for some reason, like, Dash Zero is using ClickHouse, not Elasticsearch behind the hood. So there are like a dozen time gains in many use cases. But the story is like for a lot of people, it's like a painful migration because they get used to Kibana. They already built some integration. They even pulled many queries out of Kibana and built their own software using that queries. And for them, even though they sometimes spend like millions on that system, they don't like maintaining that. They know there is a better way. The change is like very uncomfortable. And ClickHouse seems for a lot of people very low level tool to deal with, right? And a lot of people would say, I would like all of the benefits from that technology or like similar technology, like similar SQL engine, but I would like to keep my ecosystem because it actually works for me. Right?
And then you put Quesma in the middle.
Yeah. And then the Quesma in the middle could provide this visibility and all of your previous tools seem to work right out of the box, but you get way easier platform, 10 times cheaper, easier to maintain. You get like a standard SQL. You could use some data lake, which people like a lot.
And what are you seeing? I mean, you probably see a lot of customers doing migrations. What do you see? ClickHouse. There's also this company that Data are quite quick with. So what are kind of the technologies that you are seeing in the market that are evolving in that space? Or is it something self-built on top of S3, serverless? So what do you see as the stacks currently that people go from something like Elastic towards these massive, highly scaled and performant systems?
So I'm definitely seeing all of those big users desire to leave Elasticsearch. There's like quite a lot of data. Like I believe Quickwit was quite good, but they tried to break the money. They got acquired. So it seems to be great technology, but kind of like a dead end at this point. A lot of people have like, there's like hydraulics vendors. There's like people sometimes building their own system using data fusion. There's like some people willing to use Databricks. But generally, like the idea is like use fast analytical SQL engine, right? I would say ClickHouse is popular choice, but also like what people don't like about ClickHouse open source, they really like compute storage separation, which is just guarded in their enterprise license. And a lot of other solutions like hydraulics or data lakes, you don't have to even, does like a natural fit.
Yeah. And do you see Iceberg as a standard in that space or yeah?
I believe there is like a two ways. Like either people will go a long-term Iceberg with Parquet, and a lot of people will. It's not there today. The tooling is a little bit too painful for observability use case. For example, there is like in Iceberg, the schema is just recently evolving to have like a variant, like less rigid schema, right? And for a lot of observability use case, I want to have custom fields, and the Iceberg was a little bit painful with that. And the other people which say, I'm actually owning data format, but then you're still obliged to provide sometimes like SQL access or like, also like Spark access. And then you could do whatever, but then people still want like access to that underlying data platform.
Okay. And most of them, I mean, I think ClickHouse, Spark, Snowflake, they are now supporting Iceberg. So
yeah, there's
probably a migration path, or is the query changing with that and Quesma could help with that?
Yeah, I believe query changing, and I believe Iceberg, for example, got like a huge issue with real-time data. So, okay, you create files, but it got optimistic updates. So you, by default, many implementation, you have data 5 or 10 minutes behind because you create those blobs, right? So the story that is not really good for observability, where you have like system down, and actually your 10 minutes may be the most important 10 minutes in your whole data set. So I believe Iceberg is seems to be more like a cold storage. You will still need even for some last 15 minutes, some hot storage. So sometimes you will need to some kind of like data stitching business.
And the hot storage would then not be Iceberg format. It would be like a caching technology or...
Yeah, it may be that underlying your database will take data from Iceberg, but also keep like another Parquet file, another from recent data from somewhere else.
Or we did that at Instana, but also at the Zero, we also have some data like the last, I don't know, exactly 12, 24 hours, we have basically on a very immediate storage, right? Where we can access it quickly, because that's where, as you said, right? I have a problem, I have an incident. I want to have access to the data in real time. And then we put the data after that 24 hours, we put it on a more, not cold, but colder storage, which probably takes a little bit longer. Exactly.
But it's like a very common, if you look at so many observability use cases, like last 24 hours is like 99% of queries, all of your alerting, all of your security, CMBs, just during that window, you still want to access, okay, what happened when you do postmortem, but it's like not something that you are constantly willing to pay a lot of money. It's more like, okay, if investigation came, you spin up some extra clusters, but the moment they stop, you want to tear them down. While load for the last hours seems sometimes to be quite consistent because there's always like some alerting checks going on.
Great. And because we are coming to an end here, what are the next steps for you and your team? What do you want to build? Where do you see Quesma in 1, 2, 3 years?
I kind of like, we started with one use case, which is kind of like, I wish we would evolve to more use cases, and that's what we are hearing, right? Okay, nice that you do one time of migration, but this seems to be narrow problem. I wish we would have like many use cases that get market traction. I also believe these days interoperability is kind of like a table stake. It's like a good enterprise motion business, but that's mostly big companies. I believe we should also have like some features that, just give better insight. And that would be my dream, to also like build some protocol and something that, yes, there will be like open source part, but also like a way for people to build on top of, I'm just providing threat intelligence. Or maybe I'm like companies could share how they debug outages. So we could have like some common set data sets for AI agents. I believe there's a lot of innovation like that possible, but we just like the protocol or just like some standard how to make it happen.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I really enjoyed the conversation because it's really deep dive into a certain part of this whole technology stack, right? And you're very much into the details. I love it. I learned a lot. Jacek, thank you for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mirko, for your time, and it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for listening. I'm always sharing new insights and insider knowledge about observability on LinkedIn. You can follow me there for more. The podcast is produced by Zero. We make observability easy for every developer.